You're watching a German reconnaissance pilot circling over a narrow river crossing in western Ukraine, late September 1941. Below him, a kilometer-long column of tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, and artillery pieces sits motionless on a dirt road that's turned to paste under the weight of steel. The vanguard has stopped. No visible enemy, no artillery fire, no air support. Just 3 Soviet tanks dug into a tree line on the far side of a wooden bridge that wasn't supposed to be defended anymore. The pilot radios back. Command doesn't believe him. An entire Panzer Battalion, over 60 vehicles including 24 Mark IIIs and Mark IVs, multiple motorized infantry companies and support elements, has been frozen in place for the better part of a day by 3 medium tanks that, according to German intelligence assessments written just weeks earlier, shouldn't even exist in numbers worth worrying about. This is the story of how 3 T-34 Model 1940s, crewed by 15 men who weren't supposed to win, held a critical river crossing against impossible odds, bought time no one thought could be bought, and forced an entire generation of German tank designers, field commanders, and general staff analysts to confront a truth that would reshape the entire war on the Eastern Front. What you're about to hear isn't a myth. It's not Soviet propaganda inflated by post-war historians looking for morale stories. It's a micro-moment buried in divisional war diaries, verified by German after-action reports, and dissected in the painful reassessments that began flooding back to Berlin in October 1941, when panzer generals started writing frantic letters about a tank they hadn't been told to fear. Let's rewind to understand why this moment mattered. By late September 1941, Operation Barbarossa had been underway for 3 months. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was driving toward Kiev in what would become the largest encirclement battle in human history. Over 650,000 Soviet troops were being crushed in a pocket that was closing like a vice. The Red Army was collapsing. Entire Soviet mechanized corps had been shattered. Tank losses were catastrophic. German intelligence estimated that the Soviets had lost over 17,000 armored vehicles since June, most of them obsolete models like the T-26, BT-7, and the hopelessly outclassed T-37 amphibious tankette. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions were moving faster than their supply lines could support, deeper than doctrine recommended, and further than any army in modern history had advanced in such a short time. But something strange was happening at the tactical level that wasn't yet showing up in the operational maps. Tank crews in the 11th Panzer Division, the 13th Panzer Division, and the 9th Panzer Division were encountering a new Soviet tank that didn't behave like the others. It didn't break down after 10 kilometers. It didn't brew up when hit by a 37mm anti-tank round. It didn't bog down in the mud, and when it fired back, German tanks were dying. The T-34 Model 1940 wasn't entirely new to German intelligence. Small numbers had been spotted during the Winter War against Finland in 1940, and fragmentary reports had reached Berlin describing a medium tank with sloped armor and a 76mm gun. But German analysts had dismissed it. The Soviets couldn't manufacture a technically advanced tank in meaningful numbers. Soviet industry was primitive. Soviet crews were poorly trained. Soviet doctrine was rigid and unimaginative. Even if the T-34 was real, it would be a negligible factor in a campaign expected to last 8 to 10 weeks. That assumption was now killing men. The T-34 wasn't negligible, it was a revolution, and the German army wasn't ready for it. Let's talk about the tank itself, because you need to understand why 3 of them could anchor a defense that should have collapsed in minutes. The T-34 Model 1940 was the product of a Soviet design philosophy that prioritized mobility, armor protection, and firepower over crew comfort, mechanical complexity, or doctrinal flexibility. It was designed by Mikhail Koshkin and a team at the Kharkov Locomotive Factory, and it represented a complete break from the incremental tank development happening in Britain, France, and Germany. The hull was welded, not riveted, which meant no spalling, no rivets popping loose under impact and turning into shrapnel inside the crew compartment. The armor was sloped at aggressive angles, 45 degrees on the front glacis, 60 degrees on the upper hull sides. This wasn't cosmetic. Sloped armor increases effective thickness without adding weight. A 45mm plate angled at 60 degrees has the ballistic resistance of 90mm of vertical armor. German 37mm anti-tank guns, the standard weapon equipping most Panzer IIIs in 1941, couldn't penetrate the T-34's front armor at any range. Even the 50mm Kikimondi 38L42 gun on later Panzer IIIs struggled unless it hit from the side or rear at close range. The suspension was a Christie design, wide tracks, large road wheels, and long travel, which gave the T-34 exceptional cross-country mobility. It could traverse terrain that would stop a Panzer IV. It could push through mud, snow, and sand with a ground pressure lower than a man's boot. German tanks, with their narrow tracks and interleaved road wheels, would bog down in conditions the T-34 handled effortlessly. The engine was a V2-34 diesel, a 12-cylinder 500-horsepower beast that gave the 30-ton tank a top speed of 53 kilometers per hour on roads and nearly 35 off-road. Diesel fuel was less flammable than gasoline, which meant T-34s were harder to brew up. The range was 400 kilometers on internal fuel, double what a Panzer III could manage. The gun was a 76.2mm F-34, a high-velocity cannon that could punch through the frontal armor of any German tank in service in 1941 at combat ranges. It fired a 6.5-kilogram armor-piercing round at 662 meters per second. At 500 meters, it could penetrate 69mm of vertical armor. The Panzer III's maximum frontal protection was 50 mm, and that was only on the later AOSFJ models. Most Panzer IIIs in September 1941 had 30 mm. The Panzer IV, the heaviest tank in German service, had 50 mm on the turret front and 80 mm on the gun mantlet, but its hull was only 50 meters. A T-34 could kill either at ranges where neither could reliably kill it back. This wasn't a fair fight, and German crews knew it. But the T-34 had problems, serious ones. The biggest was the two-man turret. Soviet doctrine assumed that the tank commander would also serve as the gunner, which meant he had to acquire targets, track them, communicate with the driver, give orders to the loader, and fire the gun, all while trying to maintain situational awareness. German tanks had three-man turrets, commander, gunner, and loader. The commander could focus on commanding. The gunner could focus on shooting. This made German crews faster, more flexible, and more lethal in fluid engagements. The optics were poor. The commander's cupola had limited vision blocks, and the gunner's sight was crude compared to the Zeiss optics in German tanks. In long-range duels, German crews could spot and engage Soviet tanks before the T-34 crews even knew they were under fire. The transmission was fragile. Early T-34s suffered from gearbox failures, especially when operated by inexperienced drivers. The clutch was heavy and difficult to operate, and shifting gears required physical strength and skill that many conscript drivers didn't have. The radios were scarce. Most T-34s in 1941 had no radio at all. Only platoon and company commanders had them, which meant individual tanks fought blind, relying on hand signals and flag signals that were useless in combat. German tanks all had radios, every single one. This gave German platoons an overwhelming advantage in coordination. And then there was crew training. By September 1941, the Red Army had lost most of its experienced tankers. The purges of 1937 and 1938 had gutted the officer corps. The initial weeks of Barbarossa had destroyed entire mechanized corps. Replacement crews were being rushed to the front with minimal training, sometimes as little as 2 weeks in the tank. They didn't know how to use their advantages. They didn't know how to fight defensively. They didn't know how to use terrain or hull-down positions or overwatch tactics. They died quickly, but every now and then a crew didn't. Every now and then, 3 tanks ended up in the right place, with the right terrain and the right commander. The location was a crossing point over the Irpin River, a minor tributary northwest of Kiev. The bridge was a wooden structure, 15 meters long, 2 meters wide, reinforced with timber pilings that had been repaired multiple times over the past decade. It wasn't strategically critical in the grand sense. No major highway crossed it. No supply depot sat on the far side. But in the localized chaos of the Kiev encirclement, with Soviet units retreating in disorder, and German mechanized columns racing to cut off escape routes. This particular bridge had become a bottleneck. The ground on the western side of the river, the German approach, was open farmland, gently rolling, with scattered hedgerows and a few barns. Excellent tank country. The eastern side, the Soviet side, was different. A dense patch of mixed forest came right up to the riverbank, with thick underbrush and enough shadows to hide a hull-down tank from aerial observation. The road leading away from the bridge curved into the trees and disappeared. German reconnaissance had noted the bridge, marked it passable for armor, and moved on. No defenders had been spotted, no firing positions, no obstacles. That assessment was wrong. 3 T-34s from the 8th Mechanized Corps, survivors of a unit that had been shattered 10 days earlier, had withdrawn to this position under the command of Senior Lieutenant Pavel Dmitrievich Guds, a 24-year-old platoon leader from Kursk, who had been an instructor at a tank training academy before the war. Guds was not a political officer. He was not a party zealot. He was a tanker who understood machines, understood terrain, and understood that 3 tanks with no support, no infantry, no artillery, and no hope of relief had exactly one chance to survive the next 48 hours. Make the Germans think the crossing was more heavily defended than it actually was. He positioned his tanks carefully. One was placed hull down behind a low berm at the forest edge, its gun covering the bridge and the approach road. The second was pulled back into the trees, offset to the right, with a clear line of fire across the open ground on the far bank. The third was hidden deeper in the forest on the left flank, positioned to engage any attempt to flank the bridge or ford the river upstream. The fields of fire overlapped. The positions were mutually supporting, and critically, none of the tanks were visible from the air or from the German side of the river unless you knew exactly where to look. Guds told his crews to hold their fire until the Germans committed. No probing shots, no ranging fire. Let them think the bridge is undefended. Let them start crossing. Then kill the first vehicle on the bridge and the last vehicle in the column. Box them in. Make them think they're facing a company, not a platoon. Make them cautious. It was a gamble. If the Germans brought up air support, artillery, or simply decided to bypass the crossing, the 3 T-34s would be overrun or isolated. But Guds was betting that the Germans were in a hurry, that they'd already overextended their supply lines, and that they'd make the same mistake every advancing army makes: assume the enemy is beaten. The first German vehicles arrived late in the afternoon on September 24, 1941. They belonged to the 9th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, a mixed unit of armored cars, motorcycles, and a few Panzer IIs. They approached the bridge cautiously, stopped a few hundred meters back, glassed the far side with binoculars, and saw nothing. No movement, no muzzle flashes, no evidence of defensive positions. The reconnaissance commander radioed back. "Bridge is clear. No enemy contact. Recommend immediate exploitation." Behind him, the main body of the battalion was forming up. 2 companies of Panzer IIIs, 1 company of Panzer IVs, motorized infantry in half-tracks, anti-tank guns, supply trucks, and combat engineers. 60-plus vehicles. Over 800 men. The battalion commander, a major whose name appears in the war diary only as von Schelling, gave the order to advance. The first vehicle across was a Panzer II, a light tank with 15 mm of frontal armor and a 20 mm autocannon. It rolled onto the bridge, tracks clattering against the wooden planks, and made it halfway across before the T-34 hull down at the forest edge fired. The 76 mm round hit the Panzer II in the turret front, punched through the thin armor, detonated inside the crew compartment, and killed both men instantly. The tank lurched forward, lost momentum, and slumped against the bridge railing. Smoke poured from the hatches. The bridge was now blocked. The second T-34 fired immediately after, engaging a Panzer III that had pulled forward to support the reconnaissance unit. The round hit low, tore through the lower glacis, severed the transmission, and immobilized the tank. The crew bailed out, sprinting for cover as machine gun fire stitched the ground around them. Chaos erupted. German tanks that had been advancing in column now scrambled to deploy off the narrow road, trying to find firing positions in the open fields. Half-tracks reversed frantically. Motorcycle troops dove into ditches. The battalion commander ordered suppressive fire, and within seconds, over a dozen German tanks were hammering the far tree line with high explosive and machine gun fire. But they couldn't see the T-34s. The forest was too thick, the smoke was too heavy, and every time a German tank stopped moving to take aim, one of the T-34s would fire, often hitting, and when it missed, forcing the target to reposition. The third T-34, the one hidden deep on the left flank, now opened fire on the rear of the column. A supply truck exploded. A half-track flipped onto its side. Panic spread. The Germans were taking fire from multiple directions. They couldn't tell how many tanks they were facing, 5, 10, a company. Von Schelling ordered his units to pull back out of effective range and called for artillery support. The T-34s went silent. Here's where the psychology matters. The German battalion had just been stopped cold by an enemy force it couldn't see, couldn't suppress, and couldn't accurately assess. In the German army's operational culture, this was deeply unnerving. German doctrine emphasized rapid, aggressive action, combined arms coordination, and the assumption of tactical superiority. Panzer units were supposed to move, shoot, and maneuver faster than their opponents. They weren't supposed to get pinned down by hull-down defenders in prepared positions. But that's exactly what had happened. And because the T-34s had fired from concealment and then gone silent, the Germans had no way to know if they'd hit anything, if the Soviet tanks were still there, or if reinforcements were arriving. The reconnaissance pilot's earlier report of 3 tanks wasn't believed. 3 tanks couldn't have generated that volume of fire. 3 tanks couldn't have been that accurate. The battalion intelligence officer estimated they were facing at least a reinforced company, possibly with anti-tank guns and infantry support. Von Schelling made the tactically correct decision. He called for air support, requested additional artillery, and ordered his engineers to scout for alternate crossing points upstream and downstream. He wasn't going to throw his battalion into a killing ground without better intelligence. This bought goods in his crew's hours. The artillery arrived first. A battery of 105mm howitzers set up 2 kilometers behind the German lines and began shelling the forest. For 30 minutes, high explosive rounds tore through the trees, shredding branches, detonating in the underbrush, and turning the far side of the river into a smoking crater field. Inside the lead T-34, Guds and his crew huddled in the hull, listening to the impacts, feeling the shock waves, praying that none of the shells hit close enough to flip the tank or collapse the earth beneath their tracks. The noise was unbearable, concussive. Every impact felt like a hammer against the skull. The driver, a 19-year-old named Alexei who'd been a tractor mechanic before the war, was shaking. The loader was praying quietly. The gunner, a veteran named Orlov who'd fought in the Winter War, sat motionless, hands on the controls, waiting for the order to fire again. When the barrage lifted, the forest was unrecognizable. Trees had been snapped in half. The undergrowth was gone. Smoke hung in the air like fog, but the T-34s were still intact. They'd been deep enough in the forest, hull down enough behind berms and logs, that the indirect fire had missed them. The Germans didn't know that. They assumed the barrage had done its job. Von Schelling ordered a second attempt to cross the bridge. This time, combat engineers went first, dismounted infantry providing cover, with tanks in overwatch positions on the western bank. The plan was to clear the wrecked Panzer II, repair the bridge if necessary, and push through with concentrated force. The engineers reached the bridge, started working on the wreck, and that's when the T-34s fired again. The hull-down tank at the forest edge put a round into the bridge approach, killing 2 engineers and wounding 3 others. The second T-34 engaged a Panzer IV that was sitting in overwatch, hitting it in the turret side and brewing it up. The third T-34 engaged dismounted infantry with machine gun fire, forcing them to scatter. The German attack collapsed again. Von Schelling was now furious. He radioed division headquarters and demanded air support, heavy artillery, and authorization to bypass the crossing. Division replied that air support was unavailable due to weather and fuel shortages. that heavy artillery was already committed to the main Kiev pocket, and that bypassing the crossing wasn't an option, because the roads on either side were too soft for armor after recent rains. The bridge had to be taken. That left von Schelling with one option: a night assault. Nighttime tank combat in 1941 was chaotic, disorienting, and extremely dangerous. Visibility was limited to whatever moonlight existed and whatever illumination came from muzzle flashes, fires, or flares. Radios became more important because visual signals were useless. Coordination became harder because units could lose track of each other in the darkness. And the advantage of superior optics, which German tanks relied on, largely disappeared. For Guds and his 3 T-34s, the darkness was both a threat and an opportunity. The Germans attacked at 200 hours on September 25th. They came with infantry first, supported by mortars and machine gun fire, trying to suppress the Soviet positions while engineers rushed the bridge under cover of smoke. Behind them, a company of Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs waited to exploit any breakthrough. The T-34s held their fire until the infantry was within 100 meters of the bridge. Then, all three opened up simultaneously. Imagine standing in that tree line. It's the middle of the night. The only light is from distant fires still burning from the afternoon's artillery barrage. You can hear the Germans shouting, hear the rattle of small arms fire, hear the heavy rumble of tank engines idling on the far side of the river. And then, 3 76mm guns open fire at once, muzzle flashes lighting up the forest like lightning, and the noise is so overwhelming it drowns out everything else. The lead German infantry units were shredded, mortar teams were hit, machine gun nests were destroyed. A Panzer III that had pushed too far forward took a round through the side and exploded. The attack fell apart within minutes, but now the Germans knew exactly where the T-34s were. They concentrated fire on the muzzle flashes. Dozens of high-explosive rounds slammed into the forest. Trees disintegrated. The air filled with splinters and shrapnel. One of the T-34s, the one on the left flank, took a direct hit on the turret. The round didn't penetrate, but the impact jammed the turret traverse mechanism. The crew could still fire, but they couldn't rotate the turret. They were effectively immobilized. Goods ordered that tank to pull back deeper into the forest and act as a fixed gun emplacement. The other 2 T-34s repositioned, moving to new hull-down spots 50 meters from their original positions. The Germans continued shelling the old positions for another 20 minutes, wasting ammunition on empty ground. When dawn broke, the bridge was still in Soviet hands. By midday on September 25th, the German battalion had been stalled for nearly 24 hours. Casualties were mounting, fuel was running low, ammunition was being expended faster than supply trucks could deliver it. And the longer the delay lasted, the more pressure von Schelling faced from division headquarters to break through. But something else was happening. Word was spreading through the battalion about the Soviet tanks they were facing. Crews were talking. Panzer commanders were comparing notes. The tanks they'd encountered weren't the usual T-26 or BT-7s. They were bigger, faster. Their armor was impenetrable from the front. Their guns were devastating. And their crews were disciplined enough to hold fire, reposition, and fight defensively with a patience that contradicted every German assumption about Soviet tactics. A captured Soviet tanker, found wounded near the river 2 days earlier, was brought in for interrogation. He told his interrogators about the T-34. He described the armor, the gun, the speed. He said thousands of them were being produced. He said German tanks couldn't compete. The interrogation report was forwarded to Division Intelligence. Division forwarded it to Army Group South. Army Group South forwarded it to Berlin. No one believed it. On the afternoon of September 25th, a German forward observer finally spotted one of the T-34s through binoculars during a gap in the smoke. He called in an artillery strike with precise coordinates. A battery of 150mm guns opened fire. The first salvo landed short. The second landed long. The third bracketed the target. The fourth was direct. The shell hit the ground 3 meters from the T-34's hull, detonated, and the blast wave flipped the 30-ton tank onto its side. The crew survived the initial impact, but the tank was immobilized, its tracks blown off, its engine dead. Guds, who had been commanding from this tank, ordered his crew to bail out. They crawled through the driver's hatch, scrambled into the underbrush, and made it to the second T-34 under heavy machine gun fire. One man was hit in the leg. The others dragged him. Now there were 2 T-34s left. The Germans launched another assault at dusk. This time they came with everything: tanks, infantry, engineers, mortars, and concentrated machine gun fire. They pushed across the bridge under smoke, cleared the wrecked vehicles, and established a foothold on the eastern bank. The 2 remaining T-34s fought for another hour, firing, repositioning, firing again. They knocked out 2 more Panzer IIIs and immobilized a Panzer IV. But they were running out of ammunition. The tank with the jammed turret had 12 rounds left. The other had 19. Guds made the decision to withdraw. He ordered both tanks to pull back into the forest, move south along a dirt logging trail, and try to link up with any Soviet units that might still be operating in the area. They fired their remaining rounds at maximum rate to cover their withdrawal, then reversed into the trees and disappeared. The Germans took the bridge at 2100 hours on September 25th, 43 hours after they'd first arrived. The after-action report filed by von Schelling's battalion is meticulous and unusually candid. It describes the engagement in detail, notes the effectiveness of Soviet defensive tactics, and includes a paragraph that reads, translated from the German, "The Soviet tanks encountered at this crossing were of a type not previously documented in our intelligence summaries. They demonstrated superior armor protection, mobility, and firepower compared to our Panzer III and Panzer IV models. Frontal engagements were ineffective. Flanking maneuvers were difficult due to terrain constraints. Artillery was required to neutralize dug-in positions. Recommend immediate study of captured examples and reassessment of anti-tank capabilities." This report joined hundreds of similar reports flooding back to Berlin in October and November 1941. German field commanders were begging for better tanks, better guns, better tactics. The myth of Panzer invincibility was collapsing. In November 1941, a special commission was formed to study the T-34. German engineers examined captured examples. They measured the armor thickness. They tested the gun. They drove the tanks across proving grounds. They wrote reports. One German panzer general, Heinz Guderian, wrote in his memoir that the T-34 was the finest tank in the world in 1941. Another, Friedrich von Mellenthin, wrote that encountering the T-34 was one of the greatest shocks of the war. The T-34 didn't win the war by itself. It wasn't invincible. It suffered from terrible crew ergonomics, poor optics, fragile transmissions, and a lack of radios. Thousands of them were destroyed by better-trained German crews, by superior German tactics, by Luftwaffe strikes, and by mechanical failures. But it forced the Germans to adapt. It rendered entire generations of German anti-tank guns obsolete overnight. It created a technological arms race that the German war economy couldn't win. It made every German tanker, every field commander, every staff officer question the assumptions they'd brought into the Soviet Union in June 1941. And it all started with moments like this: 3 tanks, 15 men, a narrow bridge, and a 43-hour stand that shouldn't have been possible. What happened to Guds and his crews? The 2 surviving T-34s made it 30 kilometers south before running out of fuel. The crews abandoned the tanks, buried the breaches to prevent them from being used by the Germans, and walked east. Guds and 9 of his men made it through German lines and linked up with Soviet rearguard units near Poltava in early October. 3 men were captured. 2 were killed by German patrols. 1 died of his wounds. Guds was promoted to captain and given command of a tank company. He fought through the winter of 1941, survived the defense of Moscow, participated in the counteroffensive at Stalingrad, and was killed in July 1943 during the Battle of Kursk, when his T-34 was hit by a Tiger tank. He was 26 years old. Orlov, the veteran gunner from the Winter War, survived the entire conflict. He was wounded twice, decorated 4 times, and ended the war as a lieutenant in a Guards tank regiment. He lived until 1989 and gave an interview to a Soviet military historian in 1986 where he talked about the bridge crossing. He said the thing he remembered most wasn't the fear or the noise or the exhaustion. It was the silence after the Germans finally broke through. He said it felt like failure. He said it took him years to understand that holding for 43 hours wasn't failure. It was a miracle. Alexei, the 19-year-old driver, was killed 6 weeks later during a German counterattack near Kharkov. His family received notification of his death in January 1942. They never learned about the bridge. The rest of the crew members' fates are unrecorded. Soviet personnel records from this period are incomplete, contradictory, and in many cases destroyed during the chaos of the retreat. We know their ranks. We know their roles. We don't know their names. Let's zoom out and talk about what this engagement meant strategically. The 43-hour delay at the Irpin River crossing didn't stop the Kiev encirclement. It didn't save the 650,000 Soviet troops trapped in the pocket. It didn't prevent the Germans from capturing the city. But it contributed to a pattern of delays, frictions, and unexpected resistance that accumulated across the entire front during the autumn of 1941. Every hour a German mechanized column was stopped was an hour that Soviet units used to retreat, regroup, or establish new defensive lines. Every bridge that couldn't be crossed immediately forced German units to detour, consuming fuel, time, and momentum. Every engagement where German tanks proved vulnerable to Soviet fire was an engagement that eroded the psychological edge that the Wehrmacht had built during the opening weeks of Barbarossa. The 9th Panzer Division, delayed at this crossing, missed its window to cut off a Soviet rifle division that was retreating southeast toward the Dnieper. That division escaped, reformed, and fought again at Moscow in December. The fuel expended by von Schelling's battalion during the two-day fight contributed to a fuel shortage that forced the division to halt operations for resupply 3 days later, missing another exploitation opportunity. These are tiny frictions, micro-delays, individual drops in an ocean of operational chaos, but wars are won and lost in the accumulation of these moments. By December 1941, when the German offensive toward Moscow stalled in the snow and mud outside the Soviet capital, the Wehrmacht had run out of time, fuel, ammunition, and the operational momentum it had relied on since June. The myth of the Blitzkrieg had shattered, and part of the reason it shattered was because 3 T-34s at a nameless river crossing had held for 43 hours. There's a broader truth here about how technology and human will interact in war. The T-34 was a superior tank, objectively, measurably, but it didn't win battles by itself. It won battles when it was used correctly, when its advantages were leveraged, and when its weaknesses were mitigated by terrain, tactics, or crew skill. Guds understood this. He didn't try to charge across open ground. He didn't try to outshoot the Germans in a fair fight. He used the forest, the river, the hull-down positions, and the psychological effect of uncertainty to multiply the effectiveness of his 3 tanks. The Germans, conversely, had better trained crews, better optics, better radios, and better combined arms doctrine. But they were fighting in terrain that negated many of these advantages, and they were encountering a weapon system they hadn't been prepared for. Their doctrine assumed they could suppress, maneuver, and destroy Soviet armor through speed and coordination. At the Irpin River, that doctrine failed. This pattern repeated across the Eastern Front throughout 1941 and 1942. German tactical superiority was real, but it wasn't absolute. Soviet weapons, when used defensively in prepared positions, could stop German attacks. Soviet crews, when given time to learn their vehicles, could fight effectively. Soviet industry, despite massive disruptions from the German advance, was producing thousands of T-34s, and each one forced the Germans to expend resources, time, and lives to destroy it. The T-34 didn't win the war, but it made winning possible. Let's talk about the German response, because it's a case study in institutional denial, panic, adaptation, and the limits of technological solutions to strategic problems. When the first reports about the T-34 reached Berlin in July and August 1941, they were dismissed. The General Staff assumed that Soviet tank production was collapsing, that the T-34 was a prototype or limited production model, and that even if it was effective, Soviet crews were too poorly trained to use it properly. By October, this position was untenable. A meeting was held on November 25, 1941, at the headquarters of the Panzer Weapons Department in Berlin. Field commanders, engineers, and general staff officers attended. Captured T-34s had been shipped back to Germany for evaluation. Test reports were circulated. The conclusions were devastating. The T-34 was superior to every German tank in service. Its armor couldn't be penetrated by the 37mm and 50mm guns equipping most Panzer IIIs. Its mobility exceeded German designs. Its gun could destroy any German tank at combat ranges, and Soviet industry was producing it in numbers that German intelligence had underestimated by an order of magnitude. The meeting descended into arguments. Some officers proposed copying the T-34 directly. Others argued that German industrial capacity couldn't replicate Soviet welding techniques or diesel engine production. Some demanded immediate development of a new heavy tank. Others insisted on upgrading existing models. What emerged was a compromise. The Panzer IV would be upgunned with a longer 75mm cannon. A new medium tank, eventually designated the Panther, would be designed to counter the T-34. A heavy tank, the Tiger, already in development, would be rushed into production. Anti-tank guns would be upgraded to 75mm and 88mm calibers. Tactical doctrine would emphasize defensive ambushes, combined arms cooperation, and long-range engagements where German optics provided an advantage. These were good decisions. They produced effective weapons. The Panther, when it finally entered service in 1943, was arguably the best tank of the war. The Tiger was a monster. The long-barreled Panzer IV was a capable design, but they all came too late. The T-34 had already forced the Germans into a technological and industrial race they couldn't win. Soviet factories were producing 1,200 T-34s per month by mid-1942. German factories were producing 300 Panthers and Tigers combined per month at their peak in 1944. The math didn't work. The Germans couldn't replace losses, the Soviets could. And every month the war continued, Soviet crews got better. Soviet tactics improved. Soviet industry refined the T-34, adding a bigger gun, a three-man turret, better optics, and more reliable transmissions. By 1944, the T-34-85 was a match for the Panther in most combat situations, and it was being produced at twice the rate. The Germans lost the tank war because they lost the production war, but they lost the production war because the T-34 forced them into it in the first place. Let's return to the human level for a moment, because there's an important psychological dimension to what happened at that river crossing. For the 15 men in those 3 T-34s, the engagement wasn't about strategic calculations or production statistics or technological superiority. It was about survival. It was about holding a position because they'd been ordered to hold it, and because retreating meant abandoning any hope of linking up with friendly forces. It was about fear, exhaustion, thirst, hunger, and the knowledge that if they made a single mistake, they'd die. Inside a T-34 during combat, the sensory experience is overwhelming. The engine noise is deafening, a high-pitched mechanical scream that penetrates through the thin interior padding and rattles your bones. The gun recoil is violent, slamming the breech back and filling the turret with acrid smoke that burns your throat and makes your eyes water. The vibration from the tracks moving over rough ground is constant, a low-frequency shuddering that makes it impossible to stay still. The heat from the engine, even in September, turns the crew compartment into an oven. You sweat through your uniform. Your hands slip on the controls. And the terror is constant. Every sound from outside could be an incoming round. Every impact against the hull could be the one that penetrates. You have no idea if the shot you just fired hit or missed. You have no idea if the Germans are flanking you. You have no idea if your commander is still alive. You just load, aim, fire, and pray. God's kept his crews together through this. He gave clear orders. He repositioned them when necessary. He let them rest when he could. He shared his water. He told them they were doing well, that they were holding, that they mattered. Leadership in moments like this isn't about grand speeches or inspiring rhetoric. It's about small acts of competence and care that convince exhausted, terrified men that they can survive the next 5 minutes. and for 43 hours they did. The wreckage of the Panzer II that blocked the bridge on the first day remained there for weeks after the battle. German engineers eventually removed it, but by then the front had moved east, and the crossing was far behind the lines. The wrecked T-34 that had been flipped by artillery remained in the forest, slowly rusting, until scrap collectors tore it apart in the 1950s during post-war reconstruction efforts. In 1965, a Soviet veterans organization placed a small monument near the site of the crossing. It's a simple granite marker with an inscription that reads, in Russian, "Here, Soviet tankers defended the motherland." No names, no details. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something happened here. The monument is still there. Few people visit. The bridge has been replaced with a concrete structure. The forest has grown back. The fields that were once open tank country are now farmland again. If you didn't know what happened here, you'd drive past without a second glance. But in the divisional war diary of the 9th Panzer Division, archived in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, there's a single-line entry for September 24-25, 1941. It reads, "Advance delayed at Irpin River crossing due to enemy armor resistance. Casualties, 14 killed, 27 wounded. Material losses, 1 Panzer II destroyed, 3 Panzer IIIs destroyed, 2 Panzer IVs damaged. Crossing secured 2100 hours, 25 septi. 14 dead, 3 tanks destroyed, 43 hours." That's the official record. Bureaucratic, dry. But if you understand what those numbers represent, if you understand what it took to generate them, you understand why this moment mattered. There's a final broader point that needs to be made about the T-34 and its impact on the war. The T-34 represented a philosophical shift in tank design that went beyond simple technical specifications. Western tank development in the 1930s had prioritized reliability, crew, comfort, and mechanical sophistication. Tanks were expensive, complex machines that required skilled crews and extensive logistical support. This made sense for professional armies fighting limited wars. The Soviet approach was different. The T-34 was designed for mass production, high attrition, and crews with minimal training. It was uncomfortable, crude, and difficult to operate, but it worked. It could be built quickly, repaired in the field, and operated by conscripts. It was a tank designed for total war. This philosophy scared the Germans because it represented a form of warfare they couldn't match. German industry was sophisticated, but it wasn't set up for the kind of mass production the Soviets achieved. German doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, but in the Soviet Union, quantity became its own form of quality. You couldn't kill all the T-34s. There were too many of them, and everyone you destroyed was replaced within weeks. The T-34 forced the Germans to confront the reality that they were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with deeper manpower reserves, greater industrial capacity, and a willingness to accept casualties that no Western nation could stomach. This wasn't a war the Wehrmacht could win through tactical brilliance or operational art. It was a war of production, logistics, and endurance. And the Germans lost it. By the spring of 1945, over 57,000 T-34s had been produced. They fought in every major engagement on the Eastern Front. They spearheaded the offensives at Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, and the final drive into Berlin. They were exported to Soviet allies, fought in Korea, served in the Middle East, and continued to see combat in regional conflicts well into the 1990s. The T-34 became the most produced tank in history, a symbol of Soviet industrial power and military resilience. But the tank's legacy isn't just about numbers or production statistics. It's about the men who crewed them. Tens of thousands of Soviet tankers died in T-34s. They burned to death when the fuel tanks ruptured. They suffocated when the hatches jammed. They were crushed when the hull was penetrated. They froze in winter. They roasted in summer. They fought against impossible odds, with inadequate training, poor support, and commanders who often treated them as expendable. And yet they kept fighting. They held river crossings. They blunted German offensives. They counterattacked when ordered. They advanced when retreat would have been safer. Not because they were fanatics or ideologues, though some were, but because they were soldiers doing what soldiers do, following orders, protecting their comrades, and trying to survive. The three T-34s at the Irpin River weren't heroic in the mythologized sense. They didn't single-handedly change the course of the war. They didn't destroy 100 German tanks or save a city. They just held a bridge for 43 hours, and in doing so, they bought time that someone else used to retreat, regroup, or survive another day. That's not the stuff of propaganda posters. It's not dramatic enough for a Hollywood movie, but it's real, and it mattered. War is often remembered through its grand battles, its turning points, its moments of decisive action. Stalingrad, Kursk, D-Day, Berlin. These are the events that define narratives, shape historical memory, and dominate documentaries. But wars aren't won or lost in single battles. They're won and lost in the accumulation of thousands of small engagements, logistical successes and failures, tactical innovations, and human decisions made under pressure. A bridge held for 2 days, a convoy that arrives on time, a crew that doesn't panic, a commander who positions his tanks correctly. The Irpin River crossing was one of those moments. No one outside the battalion that fought there knew about it at the time. It didn't make the news. It didn't feature in propaganda. It was just another entry in a war diary, filed away and forgotten. But for the Germans, it was one more delay in a campaign that couldn't afford delays. One more indication that their assumptions about Soviet weakness were wrong. One more data point in a growing body of evidence that the war in the East wasn't going to end quickly. And for the Soviets, it was proof that resistance was possible. That well-positioned tanks, even in small numbers, could stop German advances. That the Wehrmacht wasn't invincible. That fighting back, even when outnumbered and outgunned, could work. 3 T-34s stopped an entire Panzer Battalion not because the T-34 was a superweapon, but because the men inside those tanks understood their machine, understood the terrain, and understood that sometimes holding for 1 more hour is enough. 43 hours, 3 tanks, 15 men. That's the story. Not a myth, not propaganda. Just the reality of what happened when Soviet tankers, fighting in a revolutionary weapon system that their enemy hadn't prepared for, decided that one nameless bridge in western Ukraine was worth defending. If that kind of granular human-level military history is something you want to see more of, consider subscribing.